That's just, again, one of the things that I did want to remind you guys about was the number survey and getting a kind of heads up on it. So I'll go ahead and start opening things up again for week 13 and 14 starting today. So you guys can take a look at that, even though it's not for another 2 weeks, but at least you guys can take a look ahead in advance. So, and we'll get to talking about the final next week. So, again, it's nothing to worry about. I'll provide you with everything you guys need in order to be able to do well. I'm not over here trying to pull any kind of tricks or any kind of weird things that professors can sometimes do. And so, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into lecture. Before I do that, are there any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? All right. So let's go ahead and jump into it for this morning. So we had left off with last class talking about numbers 11, 12, 13, and 14, specifically focused on the theme and the reoccurring activity of rebellion um, that happens in Israel, especially as they're journeying in the wilderness. And this is really important for us to identify as the context for so much of numbers, especially as it comes to us in the context of the wilderness. And again, what I want for us to get into our brains is this concept, either have written down somewhere or again, for you to take it to memory, is what the wilderness represents as a place, again, of testing, wilderness as a place of testing, but then also as a place where God goes to be present with his people, as a place where God goes to be present with his people. Again, it's in these two different ways in which the wilderness is depicted as these kinds of places. And so I do want to bring that up because as you go into Kings and Prophets, the wilderness will come up again, especially as it relates to one, Joshua going from the wilderness into the promised land, or from the land of Moab into the promised land. And second, it'll come up in the prophets as Yahweh desires to bring, oh, we have an issue here. The camera decided to disappear on me. Let me switch this then. Hold on just 1 second. Video. There we go. There we go. We're back, even though it looks really weird. Hold on just 1 second. There we go. Somebody decided to call me and I forgot to put on the do not disturb. All right. There we go. And now it's way too bright. Of course. There we go. So, what was I saying? I forgot what I was saying. All right, lecture's over. No. So what we had mentioned was wilderness in the prophets as a place where God will take his people into. Again, kind of recalling back to this time post Exodus when Israel was present with God right after the Exodus event. So again, that's really important for us to recognize, again, with this kind of dual image of what the wilderness will represent. And so today what we're going to talk about is this kind of recapitulating the theme of rebellion that's already happening between numbers 11 and 14, and then rehearsing it because we will reach a breaking point here in numbers 20 with what's going on specifically with this incident with Moses, and then the concept of complaining and faith, because this does come up both here in Numbers. You may or may not have heard it in sermons, which we'll talk about as well. But we have to deal with the reality of complaints, especially as they exist within the Psalms. And what sense are we to make of the psalmist complaining while at the same time not necessarily getting the same kind of flack that the Israelites do? And so I do want to bring us into that point of tension of, okay, well, there seems to be a difference between what what is going on between the two, but what marks that difference. And so I wanted to bring that up. And so I do want to bring to your attention, and before we read through Numbers 20 here in a minute, um, I want to ask us just to hear this in a couple different ways. That how many different ways can this passage be read? And you guys will notice that there's a certain section that is bold and italicized that I want for us to pay special attention to. And again, try emphasizing different words. That don't be afraid to get mean with some of the words and some of the intentions of what the author is trying to say. But obviously, don't be a jerk. But how does emphasizing certain words change the meaning of the reading of the text? And so again, in the way in which we interpret this text, what are the different interpretive possibilities depending on how we go about emphasizing a certain word? And so I'm going to go ahead and read this here, and then we'll read the next part. We'll have different people read it. And so the Israelites, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and against Aaron. So here we come upon another issue where they had no place to stay, no habitation. Then they started complaining about the food. They had no meat, so God provides meat. And now, well, then Miriam and Aaron start to have an issue with Moses, saying that they're not exclusive, but in fact they are. And so here we have an additional issue here with water. An additional issue here with water. So verse 3, the people quarreled with Moses and said, would that we had died when our kindred died before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went away from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and command the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Thus you shall bring water out of the rock for them. Thus you shall provide drink for the congregation and their livestock. So I want us to press pause here a little bit. One, to note something very specific in the context of their complaint. As I mentioned before, their complaint is about water, one of the necessary components for all of life. Yet the accusations do come up, not so much just asking for water, but what's the content of their complaint? And again, it's not just about water. What else is happening here?
It's like you took us from a place of security in the ways that they mentioned, and you've brought us to a place where we like don't know what the heck we're doing.
Yep. Yep. And again, we can't miss this comparison here. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? Again, this place where God is present with his people and the considerations that they have. And again, no place for grain, for figs, or vines, for pomegranates. And the assumption here is that there's nothing to eat. There's nowhere even to settle down to grow vines and to grow trees with pomegranates as a fruit. Why? Because there's not even water. And so again, the request here that comes about for death, would that we had died when our kindred died before the Lord. Why have you brought us out? Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord out into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? And so again, what appears to be an issue about water seems to have some other underlying currents that we need to talk about, and we'll get at here in a minute. And so Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord and by which he showed his holiness. And so there's a couple things I want for us to pay attention to before I go back to the questions. One, what's Moses being commanded to do? And again, it's going to be obvious, but I need to draw out these kinds of things in order for us to see some of the poignant things in the text that aren't necessarily so obvious. What's Moses commanded to do?
He's just commanded does it say command the rock and not strike it?
Yeah, so command the rock, or we'll say speak to the rock before their eyes. And what does he end up doing?
He strikes it.
Strikes the rock. But does Moses end up talking to anybody in between the events?
Kind of lashes out a bit.
And this is something we need to have set in our minds, that if we read through this text too quick, we miss it. Is in this instance, what we see is that take the staff, you and your brothers command the rock before your eyes yield its water. A little while later, Moses goes unprovoked. Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Again, a kind of a role reversal in the text. And again, if we go through it too quickly, we're going to miss this important point of what's happening here with Moses. That we saw rebellion happen with the people. Why don't we just all go ahead and go back to the land of Egypt? We saw Aaron and Miriam, again, in rebellion against Moses, or rebellion against Yahweh, through not trying to keep Moses accountable, but by trying to attack Moses' credibility or Moses' relationship with Yahweh. And then here we find this kind of final last break in Moses's, we'll say, disobedience or rebellion here, and Moses not doing what Yahweh has commanded him to do. But we have this phrase here, and trying to discover the meaning of this phrase that ends up getting Moses in trouble, that is of crucial importance for us to understand what's happening in this text specifically, especially as it relates to Moses. And so there's a few different ways we can choose to read this text. Again, just seeing how many different ways can we read this passage. Does anybody want to, I guess we'll do this. Does anybody want to volunteer? Just unmute yourself and say, what's up?
To read the numbers 29 to 13 right here?
Read 20, just this part right here for Moses section. So
Okay,
what I
ready.
want you to do, because again, this thing can be read in different ways, how we understand it. What I want you to do is, in reading it, if you were Moses, to make it seem like all these people are expecting you to produce the water. And so what I want you to do, again, you could think through the use of we, kind of the tone that you inflect and those kinds of things. How would you go about reading this if all the pressure is upon you to produce this water? If you want to read that out loud.
Okay. Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?
Perfect. The way you emphasize we is exactly a way we can read this. Again, the supposition that for Moses and Aaron, the responsibility is on them, not on Yahweh. Or Moses and Aaron are assuming Yahweh's responsibility for providing people with water. And so can somebody else want to read this passage? Because there's a different way we can read it as well.
I'll do it.
Go for it. All right. So one of the ways I want you to read it is as if you're teasing them. And so these people are thirsty, they're desperate, and yet they're coming to you asking for water, and you know you can make it happen. You're kind of just like, you're kind of about it because you're okay.
So just read like the whole thing or just the
Yeah, just listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? But kind of again, a little bit more mocking, teasing.
yeah. Listen, you rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?
Perfect. Perfect. And so we need to see these two different ways of reading. Again, how it comes across in our minds and how we choose to interpret this text. Because again, that kind of like lackadaisical, taunting, making fun of, kind of playing with them a little bit. Mind you, the role that Moses and Aaron and Miriam as well play in regards to what they are and who they are, what do they represent for and to Israel? That in serving as mediators, what they're doing, again, as God's mouthpiece, that when you come across as taunting, as you come across maybe even malicious, that the person then reflects God's character in either being malicious or capricious, being kind of willy-nilly, or just mean-hearted or mean-spirited. And so with these different ways of interpreting, we need to see what it is that gets Moses in trouble and kind of makes this final cut. Part of it is the disobedience, but then also the likely possibility is that what's happening in this text have these different layers to them in these different readings. And so one of the ways in which we can interpret this passage is the rhetorical question that assumes a positive answer. That you want us to bring water, and everybody just, yeah, that there's really not any malicious intent. There's not a lot going on with it. It's just kind of just straightforward that that's a rhetorical question that the people respond well to. Or it's a rhetorical question that emphasizes Moses, and this is what I brought up before with Megan's reading, that Moses and Aaron are the ones responsible for producing the water rather than God. And so again, that Moses and Aaron take upon themselves the responsibility as this kind of final last thing, that eventually you just get so tired of they got so tired of all this complaining. It seemed it could be that they just finally, that's it. We're done. We're over it. Again, as a human, there's only so much complaining you can take. And with these last three interpretations, that they have to do with the way God is presented or represented to the people. And then Maddie, what you had brought up, and what you both what you and Megan captured really well, are these different nuances of how Yahweh is being presented to the people. Because again, as representatives of God, they represent God as either malicious or just playing a game with him. Because again, their concern is that why Yahweh had brought them out into the wilderness just to die. And by not giving them water, asking this kind of question, oh, do you guys want me to give you guys water? Continues to kind of play into the narrative that, yeah, Yahweh kind of wasn't really fully 100% sure on what he was doing and bringing you guys out here.
I personally have always read this passage as Moses is just like fed up with the Israelites at this point.
Yep.
Like he's like, I've been taking crap from you guys since he got to the Red Sea. I'm kind of tired. 40 years of this, I'm kind of tired of it. So he sort of just acts out. The whole thing is just him acting out to the Israelites.
Yeah, exactly.
But without really knowing, and it's in character for Moses to do this. He's done this in the past, all the way back in Exodus. So
yeah,
he's done this in the past, and it's going to cost him again.
Yeah, he's acted up because of the complaining, but what it didn't lead to was a kind of specific kind of rebellion from what God had told him to do.
Yeah. That's what I mean. Like just like
it's kind of lashing out. Yeah,
he makes the mistake that he probably should have known better at this point.
Yeah.
To make, but at the same time, it's like, can you really blame him for being so frustrated?
Yeah,
after
definitely
40
not.
years of this.
Yeah, definitely not. And I mean, and anybody who's babysat kids for more than like an hour or two, you can't blame the dude when he's got to deal with that for like who knows how many years.
I guess I'm to point out real quick.
Mm-hmm.
This might not be like this might not be like that relevant, but
Yeah.
you know how I don't know, hopefully I'm not getting classes mixed up, but I think you were talking about when
Okay,
God was showing his loyalty to Abraham, and how, you know, the moments with um Abraham to oh wait no I think this was oh wait no I think I'm thinking of something totally different, but
Just go with it.
anyways, like
We'll
okay,
make it make sense.
I'll explain what I'm trying to say. So when you know when Abraham like lies to Pharaoh in Egypt about Sarah being his
wife?
wife,
Yeah.
yeah,
Being a sister.
and God like focuses, you know, his attention on Pharaoh for sleeping with his wife, even though he like unwillingly or unknowingly did it.
Yeah.
And how it seems like, you know, Abraham doesn't even get punished or anything for it, and how God just continues on with his plan. Um, so why does then, you know, if God is equally loyal to and equally as faithful to Moses, why does he then exempt Moses from being able to go to the promised land in this sense?
Yeah. One of them has to do with or Abraham doesn't know as much as Abraham doesn't know as much as Yahweh does, specifically in regards to what to Sinai covenant in Sinai. Sorry. And so there does seem to be some accommodations being made to Abraham and what he's doing there. And also there's no necessarily specific prohibition on what Abraham did. And so like Moses is told very specifically what to do and what not to do. But it also seems to be this kind of higher standard that God is holding Israel's leaders to that aren't necessarily universal for all people. There does seem to be some kind of sliding scale, um, specific in regards to but I mean, eventually they all get the same judgment of not being able into the promised land, except for the younger generation and for Caleb and Joshua, premised on their obedience. And so again, because there's no necessary specific disobedience, that is Abraham's, that there does seem to be some accommodations made. So there are some areas where, again, the text isn't necessarily so clear as to why Abraham is being able to do something while Moses isn't.
I've always personally wondered, why was it this incident that cost Moses his privilege to lead the Israelites into Israel?
Yeah.
Why this and not some of the other stuff I know he's been held to a higher standard.
Yeah.
But why this at this point? Because this isn't the first time they've had this kind of exchange, or that Moses has even acted out towards them for it.
Yeah.
So why this incident over all the other times this has happened?
Yeah. And it's possible because the stakes are higher at this point. That the text doesn't necessarily give an exact rationale as much as it discusses within the narrative the growing rebellion that is a part of Israel.
I mean,
struggle with
that generation had already lost its privilege to get into the promised land by that point.
Yeah.
So it's like, why sudden? I've always kind of wondered, why did Moses have to be? I mean, I know it's because of he didn't obey God, but why was it this action that cost him that when the rest of the Israelites lost that privilege or something that I guess in my view was far worse?
Yeah.
Than that. And this has always been, I don't know. I get why, but I don't understand why this particular incident is what's so costly to him and Aaron.
Yeah. And again, it's because of the way that the narrative is being laid out by the author and how the details are going from the people now through the leaders, and how that will consistently be a persistent issue as Israel goes into the land and even settles down into land. But the details and the specific occasions for why certain things cause prohibitions on entering to the promised land or entering into other things, like why Saul is why that is the problem. Again, it ties back to disobedience. Um, whereas in previous instances, there's not a specific occasion for where Moses, again, the killing of the Hebrew isn't seen as disobedience. While it may morally be wrong, in which it is, it's certainly against Torah to say it's not you're not going to kill your neighbor. But even more so than that, again, there is this kind of sliding scale in the way that Yahweh is meeting the people, and especially with these early narratives, that they aren't prescriptive in the ways in which they're just giving certain ethical treatments. And so, why this specific instance? We don't know, and there may have been other instances that warranted the same kind of effect. But what we do know is in this specific instance of what's going on, we see the thematic development of rebellion in Israel as a whole, and now within specific individuals. That does show for us the kind of thoroughness of rebellion across Israel, and how there is a small band of what will be developed later on as a remnant that chooses to stay faithful. And that's across the whole text. Whether you find that, again, with God's choosing of Abraham, even back to Noah, this kind of choosing of the faithful, or God's preservation of the righteous or the faithful ones, that happens with Noah, that happens with Abraham, and that happens here in Numbers, and it'll happen later on down the line in the prophets as well. And it'll get picked back up in the New Testament. But again, within the narrative of what we have is the author's description of how thorough rebellion has gotten, and why this specific instance. Again, it could have been about water, it could have been about food, it could have been about anything, but rather this occasion affords the possibility to be able to display what's already become an issue for Israel, but now it's reached its climax with Moses. Again, at least with the way the narrative is being put together, if that makes sense. All right. So the next two interpretations, again, it's part of this kind of malicious or capricious intent here, of God either not being able to produce the water at all, or God being able to produce the water but just doesn't want to. Again, the presentation of God as capricious or just outright malicious. Wants to, but won't to. Should, would. Doesn't want to. And so, and again, in response to your question, Josh, that the nature of Moses and Aaron's sin specific here, again, that all these interpretations do two things. That either Moses and Aaron taking the credit for themselves, or portraying God as malicious, weak, or unresponsive to legitimate needs. Again, it can be a little bit of both. Again, dependent upon the ways in which we read it. But the point is that Moses and Aaron have departed from God's command by speaking to the assembly, which is why I brought up that if we read through this narrative too quickly, we miss the point of what Moses and Aaron do in speaking to the assembly, and rather than speaking to the rock. Because again, rather than speaking to the assembly, rather than speaking to the rock, they speak to the assembly and strike the rock. And so here, what this poses for us again is this final break between Moses, the people who chose not to believe or have faith that God was going to bring them into the promised land, was able to bring them into the promised land, and the kind of final break. But this does bring up a point that even though Moses strikes the rock, water still comes out, which ought to be odd for us, but also a bit of a warning that it does seem to be that the means do matter. The ways in which a task is accomplished, even when commanded by God to do so, does seem to matter to God as a whole. That beyond the results that are produced, beyond the divine manifestation that appears, that the means do matter. It's not just about the ends, the results that are produced, but also about the means in which an act is accomplished. Because yeah, one of the things I always said is the idea that the God can use anybody or anything kind of is a double-edged sword, in that you see here, well, God can use anything. Yeah, but it was still, the point of it was still that it was still rebellion, even though it produced the result that was intended. And so again, that the means matter, the way in which something is accomplished. And so this will become especially pertinent when Solomon builds the temple, utilizing Israelite slave labor in order to have it accomplished, because Yahweh still shows up at the temple. Yet Israel, at least the leadership, the kings, are largely castigated for that. They get a lot of flack for that, in the ways in which they take advantage of the poor and they take advantage of the people. And so the means matter. But this does bring up something I do want to point out, especially as it relates to the nature of faith, that belief and trust are two sides of the same coin. So much so that in some occasions they're the same thing. And I brought up at the start of this class the ways in which we talk about faith being beyond just the cognitive stuff that we believe. And that especially in the Hebrew Bible, that one cannot believe without demonstrative trust. That is outward obedience. And a lot of this gets taken over to the New Testament as well, specifically in something like James, where faith without works is dead. And again, it's not so much that you're saved by works, nor does that faith replaces or that works replace faith, but rather this continuance from belief into action that is demonstrated obedience. And so here in this specific text, what comes into conflict is not so much that Israel, Aaron, Moses don't understand the command. It's not a point of whether or not they have the capacities to comprehend or apprehend the command in which they're given. They just simply don't obey. It's not that they don't know this one key, but rather they just simply choose not to. And that Moses just takes a departure from doing what he's told and strikes instead of speaking. Since the devil is never mentioned in the story of Moses, did Moses and the Israelites know who he was? We don't know. And anything beyond I don't know would be just grasping for air. No idea. No idea. In light of that, perhaps God punished Moses in this instant because he showed rebellion towards God, where he was supposed to lead the people out of rebellion. We can see the previous chapters, made God really upset. Exactly. And what this will give us is that anybody who's taken intro to Biblit, especially with me, but even in other classes, that it was a response. If you can see it as kind of like a proto responsibility for the kind of responsibility for kind of a proto keen. And I brought this up a 1,000 times in Intro to Biblit. So in order to preserve my joy, I'll answer my own question. But that one of the duties of the kings of Israel was to lead the people in covenant faithfulness. One of the duties of the king was to lead the people in covenant faithfulness. And so if we kind of see Moses, not necessarily as a proto-king, as kind of one of the early kings, but in being Israel's leaders, I would fair to venture that one of Moses' responsibilities in being a mediator between God and Israel was to likewise lead in the same kind of covenant faithfulness. And so again, this kind of departure from from doing what he's told and strikes instead of speaking, provides both the reinforcement for Israel to understand the primacy of obedience and loyalty, but then also warns against the pervasive threat of rebellion as a whole amongst the people, and then especially as it's produced amongst the people. Being that he gave in the sin that was in the hand of their leader in front of God, whom he sort of betrayed in the sense that's provoking God. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Again, if you can think of it as rebellion kind of finally reaching its max capacity and finally getting to Moses as well. That Moses is held responsible for his actions and not simply disregarded his actions because, well, he was under pressure. He's under a lot of stress. But no, God holds Moses responsible for his actions. And so it's in this way that it's cast as a kind of final rebellion from what Moses is doing. Again, from what he's being told and striking instead of speaking to the rock, speaking to the people, striking the rock when he's told just to speak to the rock. But what I do want to bring up is, as we talk about the subject or the concept of faith, especially as it relates to a passage like this, what we find in these specific instances are issues pertaining to complaining. The problem is that complaining and us making a diagnosis wholesale is saying like, well, complaining is always rebellion. How have you guys heard complaining characterized either in a sermon, something you heard in a chapel, in other classes, grandma, grandpa, anybody that's you've come into contact with or something that you heard? How have you heard complaining characterized, especially in relationship with Jesus? I'll let you guys.
Ungrateful.
Ungrateful. Yep.
Yep.
What else? Complaining as ingratitude. How else have you heard it described?
Prideful.
Prideful.
Like in an entitled.
Entitled. Yeah. Anybody else? What does complaining do? Or what does complaining prohibit? And there's not a specific answer I'm looking for. Again, just from what you've heard, from what you've experienced.
Contentment.
Contentment. Prohibits contentment.
I was gonna say that
Complacent.
people complain as an excuse.
As an excuse. Making up complaints. One of the ways I've heard complaining characterized as that you can't complain, otherwise you forfeit God's blessing. That if you complain, God takes away his blessing, or he doesn't. It's already kind of been stated, Megan, that you said the kind of ingratitude that it shows that you're ungrateful for what God's given you, and so God's not going to bless you if you complain. So I don't know. Does any of that resonate with you guys? Yay, nay, nah? Maybe. Elijah, you got a thumb up. Yeah. The problem with that, again, this is the way I've that's the narrative I grew up with. And especially being in a Pentecostal church, that texts like this, what we find in Numbers, that all sorts of text against complaining. The problem is that not only Numbers, but the Psalms are filled with complaints, and I'll talk about that here at the end of lecture. But the Psalms are filled with a ton of complaints. Jesus himself has a complaint on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And so what is it about what's going on here in Psalms that seems to be celebrated, a part of our Bibles, something that's encouraged for us to act on, to rehearse, to repeat, to memorize even? And what Jesus repeats later on the cross, that's seemingly okay, something that, if we put it this way, that God utters complaints from his own lips, if we were to put it that way. What is it that makes not just that okay, but a thing that is a demonstration of faithfulness, but here it seems to be strongly condemned? And I think one of the ways we can characterize some of the differences is that faith as the correct response to God's word, whether it's a word of promise or a word of command, and that the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's not complaint, it is rebellion. The opposite of faith or faithfulness, this belief, this confidence, this trust of who God is and what he's able to do, is not doubt, it's not anxiety, it's not fear, it's rebellion or disobedience, however you want to characterize it as. And so again, especially now where the concept of doubt, even though it's always a good thing to have us reconsider some of our ideas and our conceptions, especially our paradigms that often go unchallenged during seasons like this, that doubt doesn't pose as much of a problem to faith as much as it can help to refine the concept in and of itself. Again, especially our faithfulness to Jesus in the ways in which we pursue Jesus and embody Jesus's love and compassion in the world and God's kingdom in the world today. But again, under the guise of covenant, that the opposite of faith is not just unbelief, but rather rebellion or disobedience. But here in Numbers, that complaining and unbelief or mistrust start to get stacked with one another again and again and again and again until it reaches a boiling point with Moses. And that last break in Numbers 20 leads to a kind of rebellion. Again, it's not that Moses and Aaron no longer believe in God, but rather they are disobedient. And this is cause for their removal from the promised land. Again, it has very little to do cognitively in terms of what do they understand and believe about God, as much as it has everything to do with them acting upon the word in which God had given to them. And so, again, is grumbling and complaining alone an expression of unbelief? And I do want to bring this up, that grumbling and complaining alone on their own aren't expressions of unbelief, but they do seem to be stepping stones towards unbelief demonstrated in rebellion. That there's a specific kind of grumbling and complaining that takes place in the context of mistrust. And it goes beyond just keeping it real or being a realist, again, but rather this constant distrust in his power and his provision that leads one towards active rebellion. And again, it's not a sin to admit reality of personal feelings, but when these take precedent over trust in Yahweh, there are issues, and the Psalms bring this up. And so, Elijah, I think you analyze it well when you bring up that because the Israelites' complaining was out of rebellion and Jesus and the Psalms aren't, in short. That's exactly what it is. That in the attempts to make sense of God's ability and work in the world, these complaints arise. And I brought this up at the beginning of class, again, which is why it's important to memorize absolutely everything Partita's ever said. But that, especially in ancient Hebrew worldview, where God is pervasive of all of life and Yahweh as the supreme deity, these complaints make sense in light of, why are these things happening, and God, why aren't you doing anything about it? Excuse me, to the point where you have the psalmist telling God to wake up. Wake up from your slumber and arise as a warrior. I forget which psalm that's in. But then you have in other places where Yahweh neither slumbers, Lord, he who watches over Israel neither slumbers or sleeps. And I think that's Psalm 133. So again, the tensions between the two of understanding who God is and what he's able to accomplish within the world, while at the same time seeing the gaps in reality and what's not happening. And in that place where the gaps happen, where is a lot of the space for complaining, for lament, for mourning, between these gaps of knowing who God is, what he's able to do, and between what we are not seeing within the world. And so again, that it's not just about the specific provisions that Yahweh is not making possible for those in the Israelites in the wilderness. He makes them happen. He gives them meat. He gives them manna. He gives them water, taking them to a promised land. So maybe the reason why Yahweh, and again, these are partita thoughts, and it maybe just preaches, it gives you a lot of fodder for preaching. The reason why they're not allowed to camp within the wilderness is because that's not where they're meant to stay. It's always a passing through point. They're not meant to stay there. That God is taking them into a land that he's giving to them as a gift. That wilderness is not meant to be a comfortable place. This place of testing. Yeah, God is there in the wilderness. And it's a place for growth. It's a place for the development of Israel's faithfulness and loyalty and devotion. But they're meant for the promised land. To be together with Yahweh in this place together. And so again, that the possibilities for what Yahweh is developing in Israel is in this transitory place within the wilderness, and the allotment for complaint happens there. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. It seems to be a God-forsaken place, a place where God is not. Yet at the same time, it's a place where God draws his people into to be there with him, even in the midst of discomfort. And if there's anything we love as Americans more than anything else, very few things we love more than comfort. Very few things. That's why so many inventions exist.
I think another passage that can display the difference between what's going on in Numbers and complaining that isn't like rebellious.
Talk to me, Josh.
Look at what Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Attaboy.
He gets to the point where he begs God that if it's possible to remove that,
Take it.
the cup, because he's genuinely afraid of what's about to happen.
Yep.
He's known the whole time, and it's implied that this isn't even the first time he's asked this in that passage.
Yeah, several times, yeah.
The way he prays, it's implied this isn't even the first time he's asked this.
Yeah.
And yet at the end, he submits to God because he knows like this is for the greater good.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be pleasant, and neither of us is going to take any pleasure in what's about to happen, but I need to do this.
Yeah.
And remember, now of course Jesus has the advantage. He knew what was going to happen ahead of time. We don't, but it's still sort of a model that we have to trust God.
Yeah.
Even when we don't have knowledge.
Absolutely.
But it also shows that even someone with that knowledge can have doubt and can have fear.
Yeah.
And that's Jesus genuinely, his human side shining through genuinely in that moment for me. That's always been one of my favorite passages because it showed what Jesus' human side kind of was going through, even though he knew divinely that this is what he was supposed to do. But I always point to that verse. It's a perfect example of questioning God without rebelling, because he is afraid. He should be afraid. It's not going to be pleasant.
Yeah.
But it's that quiet acceptance that I'm going to honor God and I'm going to trust his will.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the modern Partita translation for that passage is, if there's a plan B, let's do it. Let's offer up one of these goats. There's plenty of them around. Let's do it. And that'll be, we'll write a Bible about that. We'll write a bunch of letters about that. But there's a couple things that I think are important for us to spend some time thinking about. One of them, again, two of them, though, you brought up, but one of them specifically, Josh, I think is really good. Of Jesus showing us the way to be human, that maybe the right response to death is fear. That maybe the right response to uncertainty, maybe the right response to injustice and evil, when it faces us head on, that it's a fitting response to occasions when we are not in the position, not just not in the position of power, but when we are recipients of injustice, that it makes sense. It's the reasonable response. And second, that for us to take Jesus's, especially those last moments, as we're coming out of Easter, but one of the things that never gets played with Good Friday, or rarely gets played with Good Friday, is the example of Jesus going to the cross, and even in the midst of our own uncertainties, to understand, not just in terms of resurrection, well, God's going to bring us through, Sunday's coming, but that even in the worst forms of injustice, like what Jesus experienced, that God is still there too, not as the means to justify the evil itself, but rather as a presence there with the people, so that even in the midst of these difficult places where injustice and darkness are seemingly prevailing, God is there too. That Jesus knows what it's like and is there too with his people. And again, it doesn't explain away the reality of evil and injustice, but rather gives us a new possibility for reimagining, where is God at in the middle of this? Where is God at? And so, again, the ways in which we work out our faithfulness, that the fitting place for these complaints that doesn't lead to rebellion and doesn't lead to us just doing whatever we want, is in bringing our complaints to God. The problem is when we provide just general descriptions, that any amount of complaining, any amount of lament, any amount of grief is going to prohibit some kind of blessing. That's not biblically accurate, and second, it's counterproductive to Christian maturity, to making us more like Jesus. Again, with what Josh brought up, that with the Jesus who brings these real complaints before God, but yet says, not my will, but yours. But there is a process that precedes that, again and again and again, of these complaints that happen. And so it would behoove us to both find and foster communities to be people who allow people to complain and to bring their complaints before God, to find that space, that place that the Psalms not only allow but encourage for us to be caught between the place of trust and hopelessness, between confidence and unsurety, between anxiety and between faith, or if you want to call that trust. And that in that middle point of saying, like the man in the Gospels, I believe, help my unbelief. After experiencing this miracle, just there's something going on. I'm not sure what's going on. And so in those gaps, to be able to faith, in an act of faith, that the most faithful thing we can do is to bring our complaints before God, and within the context of community, sort out those complaints of what's really going on. And just like what Paul says, to bear one another's burdens and thus fulfilling the law of love. There is a kind of burden that we can share with one another in allowing each other to make these kinds of complaints, but then also redirecting one another back to Jesus, back to God. And so Psalm 22, I do want to, before we end here, just read through this very quickly. I won't read the whole thing. I'll just read through verse 6. But do know, again, the complaints that come up. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel, and you, our ancestors, trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved, and you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by people. And I'll jump over to verse 9. Yet it was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe on my mother's breast. On you I was cast from birth. And since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. And so again, that there is room There is room in this relationship with God. There's room here within the text for complaining. But as an exercise of faithfulness, that we understand we bring our complaints, we bring our complaints to God, but not just to God, but within the context of community, the allowance we have for one another to likewise be able to complain and to struggle with where is God in the middle of this, to be open to praying for one another. And even if we're not in the mood to pray, but that we do not relent in bringing our questions to God, that even when we don't get an answer, but that we choose to continue to wrestle, which is where the name Israel comes from. Choose to continue to wrestle with God. Again, even more than getting answers is to seeing God work in the ways that we're trusting him to work in the world, to work for good, to work for to work towards just and equitable ends, to work to see lives restored and transformed, to see lives healed, to see people healed, to see God's kingdom flourish in places where evil seemingly is prevailing. And again, even in our own lives when we see gaps. And so, again, I say this not just as a professor, but as a pastor and as a brother. I give you guys every opportunity and permission that if there's something that you need to complain about, do it. Do it. Partita sucks. That's not one. That don't be mean. But that with the way that things are often go in life, that again during the season, dude, COVID sucks. Why are people having to pass away, losing jobs, families being torn up by this thing? And allowing what we're seeing happen and perspire in the world, there's injustice happening in the world, in our neighborhoods, people being abused, people being killed, gun violence happening. And again, of course, we could point back to the reality of just evil, the prevalence of evil in the world, while at the same time knowing that, man, Jesus, in your kingdom, you're here, but what are we seeing? What sense are we to make of it? What can I do in the world? How can I be a conduit for your kingdom in the world? A conduit for your spirit's transformational power in the world. And again, allowing yourself to mourn and lament the gaps between what we're seeing in the greater world around us, but then also what we see in our own lives. And again, reimagining the possibility for something different. And that's the point of hope. And that we don't always give up on hope just because we don't get what we want. And that's when we know we've gotten to maturity. That's when we know we've gotten to maturity. And we don't give up on hope just because we don't get what we want. Doesn't mean we don't persistently pray and we continue to ask, but we don't become atheists because we didn't get one thing. So, any comments, questions, concerns? I know I held you guys over. I shouldn't have said we were going to get out early. It's like saying bless you before you sneeze. You always make things worse. But comments, questions, concerns? All right. My office hours are going to be a little different today. I'll be going from 2 to 3. We got a doctor's appointment here at 3:30, so I got to bounce early. But yeah, if you guys don't have any questions, comments, I'll be here for a few minutes. If not, see you guys on Tuesday. See you guys.